It was the summer of 1860, and the United States stood on the brink of something terrible, though few could yet see it. In the South, the fields of cotton and tobacco stretched endlessly, tended by the calloused hands of enslaved men and women. Wealth and power had grown on the backs of these slaves, and for generations, the South had thrived under a system that was brutal, yet deeply ingrained in its way of life. In the North, however, the winds were changing. Industrialization, a growing abolitionist movement, and the moral outcry against slavery had put the two regions of the country on a collision course. Daniel Carter, a farmer from Tennessee, felt the tension even in his small town. The election of Abraham Lincoln had divided his neighbors. Some hailed Lincoln's rise to power as a promise of progress, while others saw it as a threat to their very way of life. Daniel, a man of few words and quiet strength, watched as arguments erupted in the local tavern and on the streets, friends turning against each other over the question of slavery and states' rights. For Daniel, the world was simple. He didn't own slaves, but he had grown up with the belief that each state had the right to govern itself, to make its own decisions. Yet, there was something gnawing at him, a sense that change was coming, a change that could tear the country apart. In the winter of 1860, the first shot came, not from a rifle, but from the state of South Carolina, which declared its secession from the Union on December 20th. One by one, other southern states followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. The Confederacy was born, and with it, the inevitable specter of war. By April of 1861, war was no longer a question of if, but when. On April 12, Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter, a Union stronghold in Charleston, South Carolina. The first shots of the American Civil War echoed across the harbor, and with that single volley, there was no turning back. Daniel stood in the doorway of his farmhouse as the news reached his town. War had come, and every man of fighting age was being called to choose a side. Daniel wrestled with the decision. He had no great love for the Confederacy, but Tennessee, like so many border states, was divided. His brother, Elijah, had already enlisted in the Confederate Army, full of pride and loyalty to the Southern cause. Elijah spoke of defending their home, their way of life. But Daniel hesitated, torn between the duty to family and his growing unease about the cause for which the South was fighting. In July of 1861, Daniel found himself swept up in the fervor. The Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war, was a Confederate victory, and Southern pride surged. Elijah's letters from the front were full of excitement. He wrote of the courage of their men, the glory of the battlefield. But behind his brother's enthusiasm, Daniel sensed something darker, a note of fear and uncertainty that grew with each letter. By 1862, the war had consumed the country. The Union, under President Lincoln, had mobilized its vast industrial resources, while the Confederacy, under President Jefferson Davis, rallied its men to defend their homes. The conflict stretched from Virginia to Mississippi, engulfing cities, towns, and farms alike. Daniel eventually joined the Confederate Army, more out of obligation than conviction. He could no longer stand on the sidelines as the world around him was torn apart. He marched into battle alongside men he had known all his life, but something in him had shifted. The war was not the glorious fight Elijah had imagined. It was dirty, bloody, and brutal. The war dragged on, longer and bloodier than anyone had anticipated. By the summer of 1863, the country was awash in blood. The death toll mounted with each passing day, men killed by the thousands in battles with names that would be remembered for generations: Antietam, Shiloh, Chancellorsville. More than 500,000 Americans would perish by the war's end, but at that moment, no one could see how or when it would end. The Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 marked the turning point. Daniel and Elijah both found themselves on the fields of Pennsylvania, though neither knew the other was there. The battle lasted 3 days, with Confederate General Robert E. Lee leading his army into the heart of Union territory. The two armies clashed in what would become the deadliest battle of the entire war. Daniel was stationed on the far right flank of the Confederate line on the second day of battle, his musket heavy in his hands. The sound of cannon fire and rifle shots filled the air, mingled with the cries of men and horses. Smoke clouded his vision, but he could hear the screams of the dying, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. The Union forces held their ground on Cemetery Hill, repelling wave after wave of Confederate attacks. On the third day, Lee ordered a bold assault known as Pickett's Charge. Thousands of Confederate soldiers, including Elijah, marched across an open field toward the entrenched Union position. It was a massacre. The Union artillery ripped through their ranks, and by the time the Confederates reached the Union line, half of them lay dead or dying. Daniel watched in horror as the Confederate army crumbled before his eyes. The ground was littered with the bodies of his comrades, the air thick with the stench of death. He had never seen such slaughter. After the battle, as the Confederate army retreated, Daniel searched the field for Elijah. He found him among the dead, his face pale, his body broken by a Union shell. Daniel knelt beside his brother, his heart heavy with grief and regret. He had followed Elijah into this war, but now he realized that it had never been their fight. It was a war fought for the pride and power of others, and the cost had been paid with the lives of men like Elijah. Gettysburg had been a turning point in the war, but for Daniel, it was the moment when he realized that the South could not win, and even if it did, it would not be a victory worth celebrating. As the war dragged on into 1864, the Confederacy's hope for victory began to fade. Union General Ulysses S. Grant launched a relentless campaign against Lee's forces in Virginia, while General William Tecumseh Sherman marched his army through Georgia, burning towns and crops in a campaign of total destruction known as Sherman's March to the Sea. The South's infrastructure was crumbling, its resources depleted, and its people exhausted by the unending violence. By the spring of 1865, it was clear that the war was nearing its end. Daniel, now hardened by years of fighting and the loss of his brother, fought on in the Confederate ranks, though his heart was no longer in it. He had seen too much death, too much suffering. On April 9, 1865, the inevitable happened. General Robert E. Lee, his army surrounded and starving, surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War, which had begun 4 long years earlier, was finally over. Daniel stood among the remnants of the Confederate army, watching as the white flags were raised. His hands, once calloused from farm work, were now scarred from the battles he had fought. The war had ended, but the wounds it left would last for generations. Elijah was gone, buried in a shallow grave on a Pennsylvania battlefield. Daniel's home in Tennessee had been destroyed, his town devastated by the conflict. But the greatest wound was the wound in the nation itself. The war had claimed over 620,000 lives, more than any other conflict in American history. It had pitted brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. It had shattered the South and forever changed the landscape of the United States. As Daniel walked away from the battlefield, he knew that the war's end was not truly the end. The country faced the monumental task of rebuilding, of healing the deep divisions that had led to the conflict in the first place. Slavery was over, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had seen to that, but the question of true equality for Black Americans was far from resolved. The years following the Civil War were known as Reconstruction, a time when the federal government sought to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society. For Daniel, it was a time of uncertainty. He returned to Tennessee, but his farm was in ruins, and the economy of the South had collapsed. The old way of life was gone, and with it, the world Daniel had once known. Reconstruction brought hope to some, especially the newly freed black men and women who sought to build lives of their own, free from bondage. But it also brought resentment and violence. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups terrorized black communities and sought to undermine the progress that had been made. For Daniel, the war had taught him that true freedom was worth fighting for. He had seen the horrors of slavery up close, had watched as men like Elijah fought and died to defend a system that was fundamentally unjust. As the years passed, Daniel found himself working alongside freedmen, rebuilding his farm with their help. He saw in them the same strength and determination that had carried him through the war. But the scars of the war remained. The South was a land of ruins, its people divided by the legacy of slavery. Yet, there was a glimmer of hope. The war had ended, and with it, the institution of slavery. The country had paid a terrible price, but perhaps, in time, it could find a way to heal. Years passed, and Daniel grew old. He lived to see the South slowly rebuild, to see the United States struggle with the legacy of the Civil War. He watched as the descendants of slaves fought for their rights, for the equality promised to them in the Emancipation Proclamation. The war had ended, but its lessons lived on. Daniel knew that the true battle was not fought with muskets and cannons, but in the hearts of men. The fight for justice, for equality, was a battle that would continue long after he was gone. As he sat on his porch one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills, Daniel thought of Elijah, of Gettysburg, and of the war that had torn the nation apart. The wounds were deep, but perhaps, with time, they could heal.